Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Champions of Self Visual Podcast. My name is Ben Eden, your host, and I'm happy to welcome today Neil Wattier. He and I met through LinkedIn. We had a great conversation there. We actually ended up talking on the phone. I got to know Neil a little bit. Loved the things that he was talking about, and I'm happy to have him on the podcast today. Neil, how are you?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Hey, Neil, so to get started, will you tell us a bit about who you are and what you do?
You bet. I am a resilience and mental performance coach. I'm a 25-year Air Force veteran, and after spending many years in senior leadership positions and working with people in leadership development and communication and, all the different typical, corporate type personal professional development areas, I landed in a position where I'm a resilience coordinator, and it really stuck with me as a very specific, a very special area where it's not just about helping people, develop leadership and organizations, and it's very specific to mental performance. So what I did was I went out and I started a resilience and mental performance consulting firm where I help people learn skills to grow and thrive through stress and adversity and propel their mental performance from good to great.
Awesome. And do you have a sweet setup over there? So do you do podcasts as well?
I do. Yep. So I started my own podcast called the Neil Wattier Podcast, and it's me bringing on guests to tell their stories of adversity and overcoming adversity. And the simple tagline is real stories of resilience. And I actually just had a guest on earlier this afternoon. We were live on Facebook, and I'll be posting that out as well. But really, I don't have a very specific area that I wanted to go with that. I've talked to a lot of friends and coworkers. I've also talked to mental health professionals, other coaches. It's just a way to help people tell their stories of overcoming adversity and how they did it, or to give people advice on how they can overcome adversity and really strive for high-end mental performance, optimizing mental performance.
Very good. So, and I think because I watched a bit of it today. You're on what, episode 22 of that?
Today was episode 22. Yes.
Very good.
Yeah.
So to help the listeners a bit, if you would define resilience and mental performance a bit more, as well as go into kind of why you feel it's so important to focus so much time on it.
The best analogy that I use is, imagine grass, like your front yard, right? If a truck drives through your front yard, that's a bad day to be grass. Like, there's going to be a lot of damage, and it's going to take a lot of work to get that back to the beautiful lawn that it once was, right? And that's a significant adverse effect in the day of grass. Now, similarly, if I walk out my front door and I walk straight out to my mailbox, I'm going to walk through my front yard. Once or twice is not going to be a big deal, but over time, 30, 40, 50 days, I'm going to start wearing a trail. And that's my idea of stress, daily stress that we exhibit and that we experience. And that could be, it could be positive or negative stress, because even good things are still stressful, right? Whether you're talking about relationships, children, jobs, moving, investing, like there's a lot of really good things that are still really stressful. And if we don't take account of those things that are affecting us, they're going to continue to affect us, but we're not going to see the effects of those things further down the line. So when you look at both stress and adversity, the things that we deal with daily, the stress of relationships and our jobs, and even vacations, going on vacation is still stressful. It's fun, but it's still stressful. But then also preparing for those occasional events, and maybe it's an extended event, kind of like what we're facing right now with coronavirus, with COVID-19, where things are disrupted significantly, and there's very few people that are not affected by this. When you look at businesses that are thriving are the ones that are able to adjust and find their way through, but they're using skills in order to do that. So what I talk to people about, and when you think about that little tagline, that little, saying that I've got, skills that help you grow and thrive through stress and adversity, the very first thing that I point out is skills, because resilience is not a trait. Right? Resilience is something that we can all develop. And so I talk about it as a set of skills that helps you grow and thrive, right? Resilience is similar to leadership. Leadership itself is not a skill. Leadership is a set of skills that you use to become a better leader. Resilience is a set of skills that help you become more mentally strong, more emotionally connected, and able to have things like vision and coping skill, coping mechanisms, and have some type of goal path that you want to go on. Similarly, the idea of growing and thriving is my idea of I don't want you to survive. And coping mechanisms are good, but those are more of short term, right? So a lot of people talk about resilience and they say, well, I want to bounce back. I understand the purpose behind that statement, but to me, if you go through a significant amount of stress or a significant adverse event, I don't want you to bounce back to who you were before. I want you to grow and thrive and learn and to be more emotionally connected, to be more mentally strong. I want you to continuously grow and thrive, not just survive. And then I go even further, because a lot of times when you talk about like resilience, people talk about like getting through difficult times. Okay. So there might be something really difficult. So if you imagine on a spectrum from left to right, so on the one side, you have something's going wrong. There's a significant amount of stress or there's an adverse effect, right? On the other side, you have people that are doing really, really well, but they want to do great. So that's the idea of pushing you from good to great and constantly pushing you or your team to that right end of the spectrum where you are looking for that extra 1 or 2% every single day, where you constantly want to push the edges and get as good as you can. And it's really important to look at it as a spectrum like that, because not only is everybody at a different place on that, but each individual is going to be all over the place, because you look at relationships and finances and education and jobs and all the different areas of your life. It's going to be scattered all over that thing. And so, your relationship might be okay, but you're not happy with your job, and maybe your fitness isn't where it should be, so you're all over the place. And it's the idea of, we should be able to learn skills that I can apply in every area in my life and constantly push to that right end of the spectrum to get you from good to great.
Very good. I like that, especially where it's kind of the principle of, you could bounce back from one thing, but what about when the next thing comes, right? But if you learn the skills that you're talking about, then you can get through and you can continually go from good to great. I really like that.
Right. Yeah. And, you were talking about, so your emphasis has to do with like emotional pain and recovering from, some emotional issues, emotional pain, emotional scarring. The thing that I like to talk about, because I focus primarily on mental skills, but mental, emotional, and physical are interconnected. You can't have one really good without addressing all three. And if you have one that's significantly affected in a bad way, they're all three going to be affected. But I tend to start with mental, and the reason why is I look at emotions as a result, right? Emotions aren't things that are supposed to control us, and emotions are not necessarily supposed to drive us. Emotions are the result of your thoughts. So if we think about, in a sense, that events in your life do not dictate your emotions, right? So an example, driving in traffic does not make you angry or frustrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
You said something to yourself that drove you to anger or frustration, right?
Right.
So if you have the awareness that your thoughts drive your emotions, not dictated by the events, your thoughts are your interpretations of the events, and your thoughts then will turn around and they will drive your emotions and your physical reactions, right? So I use a simple example of, let's say that you're having an argument with someone you care about, and the first thing that pops in your head is, they never listen to what I have to say. That kind of thought in that situation drives things like resentment, irritability, anger, and it drives increased heart rate. Now my muscles are tense. Now I'm going to talk louder because I feel like I need to get my point across, right? That was all driven by your thought. It has nothing to do with the fact that you're in an argument, right? Because you can be in an argument with somebody and have a moment of clarity and say, you know what? I really value this relationship, and I feel like I want a productive end to this, right? Those are really good self-talk. That's really good productive self-talk, because what that drives is empathy and compassion. And now it encourages me to listen to the other person. But that was all driven by my thoughts, right? So it's still the same situation. You're having an argument with somebody you care about. What you say to yourself is what's going to dictate your emotions and your physical reactions.
Mm-hmm. So I love these principles. to help somebody, let's say those emotions that we don't understand as much, right? We talked about anger, sometimes it's sadness. Some people talk about depression, anxiety, those things that might feel like a cloud and it's like, well, I can't see through it and I just don't know what to do. So therefore I am controlled by my feelings or my emotions. What other tools can you provide that say, your feelings are valid, but you still have control over them?
And I'm glad you said that, because that was going to be my next point. Your emotions are neutral. All emotions are valid at any point in time, right? So no emotion is good or bad. It depends on what's the outcome that you're looking for, right? Because I'll do workshops and I'd have them do a drill. I break up into groups and I say 3 minutes and you list as many emotions as possible and put the negative on the left and the positive on the right, right? And it's usually typical. The good ones are happy and joyful and ecstatic and like happy emotions, right? And on the other side, you have depression and anxiety and anger, right? And I'm not talking about clinical anxiety. I'm talking about I feel sad, right? I feel depressed, because clinical anxiety is a different conversation. And I'm not clinical. That's not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about an individual who can develop skills to help themselves for the most part. Now, when we talk about emotions, no emotion is positive or negative until you label it so, right? Because a lot of people like to say anger is a negative emotion, but can you think of a time where anger was productive in the situation and got you to a place that you needed to be, or it got the point across, right? Anger is a lot of people think that anger is bad, but anger has its place if you use it properly for a productive end. So no emotion is good or bad. Every emotion has its place and every emotion is valid. And that's especially important when you think about like grief, because there's a certain number of there's stages of grief, right? And if you productively feel and process all the emotions associated with grief, you will come out on the other end more productive, right? The problem is when you start trying to suppress certain emotions or ignore certain things. Now you've got a problem. If you don't process guilt, or if you don't process anger or even denial, like that's one of the stages. If you don't process that appropriately, that's when you start to have issues. And one of my favorite things to do is being being in the military for so long. I love going into large groups where it's primarily men and start talking about emotions, because you can see it in their eyes, like, is this really what we're going to talk about today? But then you start having these productive conversations where I start telling them, emotions is not a tool that you use. Emotion is the result. It's what you feel after you have thoughts. So if you look at emotions as what is it that I want to feel, and what thought do I need to have to drive the emotion, right? So if I'm in a situation where anger might be a good thing, because anger comes about when you've been wronged, somebody did something wrong to you, maybe you need to process that anger. As long as you do it properly, you come out to a more productive end.
Right. I love what you say, with the principle of each emotion has two sides to it, as it were. And we just have to understand the emotion so we can know what message our body's trying to tell us with that anger. Is it, hey, somebody's my enemy? Or is it showing me that something's important and it's going to drive me to do something about it, right?
That's right. Yeah. And I had wrote a couple notes down I wanted to make sure I hit. So when you think about like thoughts and emotions, you got to make sure that you separate the two, because you can't say things like, let's get real harsh, I feel like a failure, right? You don't feel like a failure. You're telling yourself you're a failure. And by telling yourself you're a failure, you feel emotions along the lines of disappointment or guilt or shame or something like, right? You feel something as a result of what you told yourself. So you have to be really careful in the words that you use. So you can't say, I feel like a failure. What you need to say is, if you fell short of expectations, then just say that I fell short of expectations, or I feel like I didn't live up to my standards. Those are productive statements that you can use, because it gives you something to build from. Okay. Because we've had there's a lot of people out there that talk about failure is not bad. Failure is a learning opportunity. So if you take failure as a learning opportunity, including the idea of, maybe my relationship ended, right? Whether I decided to end it or somebody, ended the relationship, there's still emotion you have to process. And it's the idea of you have to say productive things to yourself in order to have productive outcome. A friend of mine once told me you can't have a positive outcome from a negative input. So think
There you
about
go.
that for a second. You can't have a positive outcome from a negative input. And you can implement that anywhere in your life, from nutrition to fitness to your job to your relationships to your own mental state. So if you input negative, you can't expect to have a positive outcome. And if anything else, even if you can't input positive, just stay neutral. So don't beat yourself up. Don't say I'm a failure. Say I didn't live up to the standards that I set for myself, or I didn't live up to the standards that somebody set for me. Right? Because that still sounds a little harsh, but it's still productive. It still gives you something that you can control. And that's
Mhm.
very important. When we talk about things like fear and anxiety are a result, and again, not clinical anxiety, just I feel nervous, right?
Right.
Fear and anxiety result when you focus on things that you can't control. When you focus on things you can't control, it's ambiguous. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I can't manage change. That's when fear and anxiety start to come about. So in a situation where I work with somebody that tends to be high anxiety, I immediately give them a grounding tool. So one of my favorites is you count back from 5 to 1, and you start off slowly. So 5, and then you stop at 5, and you 5 things that I can see. 4 things I can hear. 3 things I can smell. 2 things I can hear. Right? You go through all the senses, the 5 senses down to 1,
Hmm.
and then you're sitting down and you take a deep breath, and now you've grounded, you've oriented yourself with your environment, and now you're in a position where the next question after you have a chance to take a breath is, what am I in control of? And usually the first thing is, I'm sitting down. Now what? Do I want to stay sitting down, or do I want to stand up? And it seems so simple and insignificant, but a lot of times the simple things are very, very effective, like gratitude, right? So if I'm having you sit down and you're focused on what can I control, because that's what's going to help disperse the fear and the anxiety. I'm sitting down. Do I want to stand up, or do I want to stay sitting down? Right? And those are okay, now I'm thirsty. Do I want to go get a drink? What do I want to drink? Those are the kind of things that you can then build from, because you're allowing yourself to take control of what you have control over. And
Hmm.
that's what's going to help. You talk about anxiety and fear. You get into catastrophic thinking is real dangerous, because that's where people's thoughts just run away, and they go in this downward spiral of this is wrong, and now this is wrong, and this is wrong, and then I'm going to lose my job, and you get in this big conversation with yourself where every step and every word leads to something bad. And sometimes it's hard to pull yourself out of that, but you definitely can. And again, that's a longer conversation, because there's just skills that you have to learn, right? So
Hmm.
grounding is very effective, because it helps you center and push away the things you can't control, so that you can focus on even just the few things that you can control.
Right. I love that. A couple questions for you, and I'll give you a bit of context before I ask them. So, it's important for us to be able to understand and acknowledge our emotions by naming them, because that puts a boundary on them and it gives us control over something that used to be ambiguous. Then, where a lot of people aren't used to processing emotion. So with anger or sadness, maybe they grew up thinking sadness is bad, you can't be it because we don't want you to be moping around, or anger, that's explosive, so we don't want that either. So they don't have that experience of processing that emotion. So with those contexts, and I know you've said a bit about it already, but with this subject now, what would you say to somebody who, let's just say, maybe needs some help with the vocabulary of emotions, right? Sometimes we just don't know what it is. And if we knew, great. And then we could work on the steps of processing. What do you say about those?
I think that's a great place to start, because when I sit people down in groups and I do that exercise, what you start to realize is, number one, we have a tendency, and this is with most, not all, but most of the time, you start seeing people are easily flow with what they perceive to be negative emotions, right? And they will either make comments like, holy cow, look at all the negatives we got, we need to come up with positives, or they'll just start doing opposites of, because they need to match, right? We as humans have a tendency to look for negative. And that's the brain's defense mechanism, where historically, through evolution, our brain looks for danger. It's a defense mechanism, and it's a good thing. Until modern day, we live in a relatively safe society. And other than looking left and right before I cross the street, what danger am I really facing? But your
Right.
brain still wants to look for it. So if it can't find danger, it's going to find gossip, it's going to find rumors, it's going to find negativity, right? So you have to be aware of how your brain works, and understand that you might have a tendency to look for those negative things. So even if we start talking about vocabulary, you have to be aware that you might be looking at negative emotions, and that's going to perpetuate that cycle. So it's the idea of, if a negative emotion pops into your head, what's the exact opposite, right? If I feel sad, what's the exact opposite? And just at least putting it into your head and reminding you that it's an option is a start, right? I feel really sad. What's the opposite of sad? Or what's at least a step in the right direction? Okay, so maybe go from sad to glad or content, or whatever it is, that what's the next step that I can take, or focus on the long-term vision. How do I get to happy? Which is sometimes really difficult when you're talking about somebody excuse me, who might be sad. But then there's also the subject that every emotion that you feel is valid, right? Because just like I said, there's no such thing as a good or a bad emotion. Every emotion that you feel is valid. And people, first of all, you need to accept that what I'm feeling is what I'm feeling, and I need to own it. And there's a reason why I'm feeling it. And so, and that goes along with thoughts as well. You might have some, really negative thoughts. Well, they're in your head for a reason, whether it's something you experienced or something that somebody put into your head, by watching other people. It may not necessarily what you believe, but you thought it for a reason. Same thing. You feel emotions. You need to own those emotions, and it's okay. If I feel angry, the first thing I want to know is, why am I so angry? Because I'm feeling it for a reason, and it's okay. Own it and process it and move on. And most emotions that you feel, the emotions come from your self-talk. So chances are you're the one that's driving it, because again, we know events do not drive your emotions. People do not drive your emotions. You drive your emotions based on what you say. So, going back to specifically to your question, when it comes to vocabulary, it's just like learning anything else. You just got to go out there and start listing them down. If you feel something, write it down and own it. Over time, you're going to start feeling, this is what I feel today. But then understanding, learning the emotion, right? So I was working with my 5-year-old nephew a few weeks ago, and we were working on some Legos, and he was getting really mad. And so, looking at an opportunity, me being the great uncle, I'm like, hey, let's talk about this. So I said, what's wrong? And he says, well, I'm just so mad. I can't get this to fit. So as I'm, helping him, trying to work on it, I said, I don't think you're mad. I said, I think you're frustrated. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, yeah, mad is like you're upset at something. Frustrated is like, it's supposed to go here, but it won't go. And he's like, yeah, you're right. You can kind of see him processing it as much as a 5-year-old can. But he's like, yeah, you're right. I'm not mad. I'm frustrated because I know this is how it's supposed to go, and it won't go. Right. So helping people understand. And I use the example of, maybe, have you ever seen that big poster where it's got all the faces, and then it's got like the what this face means, this emotion, right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that people need. And they need to see that there is a very large vocabulary of emotions out there, and purposely so. Because if you think about it, what's the difference between happy and glad? Like, I don't know, it means something different to everybody else, but that's the point, right? We have so many emotions because, first of all, everybody feels emotions differently, right? But also, it also could be intensity, right? Because what's the difference between upset, mad, and rage? Right? You can almost feel it in the words. It denotes intensity. So it's important to have a range of emotions so that we can identify what we're actually feeling. So therefore, we can go back and we can address what we're thinking, so we can understand how it's being driven. But likewise, the larger of a vocabulary that we have for emotions, the more likely we are to be empathetic to other people, because we might be able to understand what they're feeling.
100%. That's huge. I love this. This is actually, it's almost like listening to a book of a book that I'm reading right now. So this is awesome.
I love it.
So we've heard some awesome principles today, marvelous things that if people could fully understand and apply, then we'd make some great headway with emotions and resilience. So let's put it to a personal story for a bit. You've shared some good stories, but how about in your life? Can you share any story where you've overcome some emotions or emotional pain? And how did you
Yeah.
do?
Oh yeah. I've got a recent one too. So um, I'm 25 years into my military career, and um, within the last 2 years, I experienced the end of a relationship, and it was, to put it very bluntly, it was very, very ugly. I chose to end the relationship, and then shortly after that, I was essentially attacked verbally by not only my former spouse but several of her friends. They spent an an exorbitant amount of time trying to attack me and spread rumors and lies, and essentially character assassination. And it was really, really difficult because we were heavily involved in several communities that I absolutely loved. And since then, I have chosen to walk away from those communities. Um, because I didn't want other people to be uncomfortable simply because of what I was going through. And several people told me, don't do that, don't walk away, we appreciate you here. But there was just too much, and it was too many reminders, and it was odd. And so I chose to walk away from the community, even though I'm still friends with certain people. But it was really difficult to be involved in a community where I gave what I felt like was all of my heart and all of my effort, and to have people turn against and believe the things, or what sometimes was even more difficult was to be completely um, uninterested and to just turn their back and wash their hands of the entire situation. And I get some people, they don't want to get caught up in the drama, but when you spent so much time with people and you care about them so much, to have people turn their back on you or to question you or maybe to be friendly with you to your face but know that they're saying things behind your back is really, really difficult. So over the last, let's just call it 2 years, just for round numbers, um, I've spent as much energy as I can just focusing on me and moving forward, which is really, really difficult when you have so much effort being placed against you to 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 threaten my quality of life, my wellness, my job. They were going to say a bunch of things, to as much as they could, and they did. And it was yeah, it was a bad situation. And relationships are hard enough to end, but when somebody feels it necessary to go the extra effort just to hurt you is hard to swallow. I don't understand that mindset, um, and I'm actually very happy with the way that I handled it, because as much as I could, I ignored it. I talked to the people that were most important to me. I talked to a few more people just to set the record straight, and then we went our separate ways. But I didn't do anything in retaliation. I just did what I do best and tried to be the same person that I knew I was. And it was really, really difficult. And it took everything in me to actually accomplish that, because all I wanted to do was lash out and to fight back. But number one, that's not me. And number two, that would have done no good. Right. So it was a lot of the mental performance skills that I teach that I had been lucky enough to, already be trained and already be teaching so that I could implement a lot of them. Some of the simplest ones that I tell people are things like gratitude, because most people don't think about gratitude as a skill.
Mm-hmm.
Gratitude is a skill, and you have to practice it, because again, you go back to your mind wants to look for danger, right? And there's plenty of good and bad things. You're going to find what you're looking for. The more you look for the good, the more good you're going to find. And that's not blindly ignoring the bad, because you still have to be responsible for that. But if you're going to go through your day and you're going to look for the bad, you're going to find it. If you're going to look for the good, you're going to find it. And being in a I recently started my master's degree in performance psychology. One of the things that I'm learning about is the brain and neuroplasticity and all the things, how the brain can change and basically updates its programming, its neurological systems.
Mm-hmm.
So without getting into a lot of the sciencey nerd stuff, it's the idea that your brain learns, right, which we already know, but it's interesting in how it does it, because it will actually change the way that your neurons fire and the areas of your brain that are being used, whether you're looking for the positive or the negative. And by doing what, like a gratitude challenge, where 30 days you're doing this gratitude challenge that I set up, where you look for 3 things and then you ask yourself a short list of questions and you write a reflection. That's why I call it a skill, because you actually have to practice it. If you do that for 30 days, science has shown that you rewire the brain.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's very powerful to me. So the idea of something simple like gratitude, going outside of your mental, is using your resources. In the military, we've done a good job recently about really emphasizing the importance of mental health and trying to reduce the stigma. So not only using the resources available to you, but also looking to the people that are there for you. We talked about this earlier with another person that was on my podcast, is how do you go from one place to another where you don't know anybody and you can't find a job and you can't place to live and essentially you're homeless for a little while. I could imagine any number of times in my past where if I didn't have quality people in my life, I could have been in a lot of trouble, and I would definitely not be where I'm at right now. Whether it be advice or money or just, a little bit of help from here, from time to time. I've been very lucky to have people in my life who care about me, and that's part of resilience, because nobody's self-made. Everybody needs somebody, because if I'm not feeling strong, I can lean on somebody else. Ultimately, however, resilience is up to the individual. I can't be resilient for you, and you can't be resilient for other people. Ultimately, it's the individual's responsibility. They have to learn the skills, and that's why I love this so much. That's why I'm so passionate, because there's so many things that we can do to help people, to empower people, and to hold people accountable to make sure that they are doing what they need to do.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's always neat for the listeners to hear stories of people who've made it through a tough situation that I'm sure came with a myriad of emotions. But it showed that you were able to take control over your behavior and do what you knew to be right instead of, follow the temptation of the anger or the revenge feelings like that. So those tools are very important of what we can do. And I also like to remember, or to remind people, that it's important to label the emotions and experience them like we've been talking about, because if we just jump to the solutions, then it can be seen as a band-aid being placed over a wound that hasn't been fully cleaned yet, and it lasts longer. So what we've talked about today is very important: to name the emotion, understand it, process it, so that the tools of everything we've talked about, like gratitude and reaching out to people and everything else, those will be more effective.
Yeah, that's very true. And remember that emotions are just emotions. They are neutral until you label them. So use them and remember that they are the result. They are not the driver. Okay. Your
Yeah.
thoughts, and you have to keep those separate, and that's extremely important. And I know that we have limited time on this show, and this is actually my favorite thing to talk about. And in my workshops, I have a hard time squeezing this information into an hour and a half, but I would certainly be happy to talk to anybody who's confused or doesn't know how to use this. I love this subject. I post a lot of things on my Facebook, my YouTube. I talk about it on my podcast, and Ben, I'm really excited that you asked me to come on here, because I think it's extremely important. Especially with the emphasis on mental health, is you can go talk to a counselor, and you should, if you feel the need to. But remember, ultimately, it is your responsibility. You have to be resilient for yourself, and you have to learn the skills. Counselors can help you do that. Resilience and mental performance consultants can help you do that. Just don't. Number one thing I would probably tell people walking away from this relationship is, do not mentally beat yourself up.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have a positive outcome from a negative input. So keep putting in positive.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. Where can people get a hold of you if they'd like to connect with you on social media?
Primarily on LinkedIn and Facebook, but I post them all over the place, including my videos on YouTube. But the name and the face and the logo are all the same. I don't customize anything. And then the Neil Wattier podcast is on all the podcast forums, but it's also at neilwattier.com.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Neil. Everybody, this has been another episode of the Champions of Self Visual Podcast. We're grateful to have had Neil today, and we'll see you next week.